Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
With a grand sweep of the hand, my corps commander, Boy Browning, drew a third large circle on the talc-covered map, and fixing me with his hard and direct gaze, said, "Arnhem Bridge, and hold it."
Leap out into space. The ground seemed close. Hold your breath while the static line pays out. The harness snaps around your body and you gasp with relief as that beautiful canopy opens above you. Very little wind. Good. Pay out the line on your drop bag strapped to your leg. It hits the ground. Your descent slows and then your feet meet terra firma. Great! Piece of cake. No problems. Canopy collapses. Hit the quick release and join your mates as soon as possible. Everyone feels alone when making a jump. It's a strictly personal thing. Open the drop bag, grab rifle, ammo. Oh, get this bloody oversmock off. Always a damn nuisance. Now, then, where are we? Follow the crowd. Jeeps come into view. Familiar faces with a variety of expressions. Come on, someone shouts. We've got to get to that fucking bridge. And those...
That's a terrific quote, isn't it?
It's amazing, isn't it? Those were the voices of Major General Roy Urquhart, of course.
Obviously.
On receiving orders from his corps commander, Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, and Trooper Des Evans of C Troop 1st Air Landing Recce Squadron at the opposite ends of the 1st Airborne spectrum for Operation Market Garden. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Achtung, Achtung!
The moment has arrived.
Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, when we are... As the 80th anniversary approaches, we are grasping the nettle of Operation Market Garden, hopefully in all its glory, because it's a glorious battle, let make no mistake. It may not be one with the result you're necessarily after, but it's chock full of glory, some extraordinary moments.
Plenty of twists and turns.
Twists and turns, and very, very, very slender moments of opportunity and moments of margins. And, you know, if you think everything's preordained, this is one of those battles for you where it might look like that from the start, but really there's so much contingency in all of this. That's why we're drawn back to it. And I don't know about you, Jim, whenever I read a Market Garden account, there's a little bit of me going, go on, do it this time.
Yeah. Go on, get across the bridge. Come on, you can do it.
For Christ's sake.
Don't worry about the Jerry's, just go for it. Exactly.
And why have you gone north? Come, go down the southern route. Do it right now.
No, not the Grosbeak Heights.
Exactly.
Get to Nijmegen Bridge. Isn't it amazing, though, that after all the times we've been reading about it, walking the ground, looking at it, you're so right. There's still that little part of us that is willing them to turn the tables and
flip it,
win.
And maybe the war's over by Christmas, and then we live in maybe quite a different world. Even
who knows? Well, I wouldn't have the next book to write, that's for sure.
I mean, if nothing else, the British share in the victory, if the war's over by Christmas, the victory in Europe, will be a different one, wouldn't it, politically?
Yeah. But can I just say, I think we're jumping the gun here. This is supposed to be in episode 6, or it could be 10 by the time we get there. So that's a little kind of an hors d'oeuvre of a preamble. An amuse-bouche before we get to the main...
An amuse-bouche. What we thought we'd do with this series is we're going to start in Arnhem, but we're going to start with 1st Airborne Division, and we're going to look, and the Poles, of course, 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade. What we also thought we'd do is sort of canter through the planning and some of the planning considerations, who 1st Airborne are, what they represent, really.
Yes.
Because they're a very, very peculiar outfit.
Diverse bunch.
Yeah. A
disparate bunch, I think, is probably a better word. Disparate, not diverse, disparate.
And in every sense, because after all, one of the issues with an airborne division is it has to be deployed where it's going to embark. So gliders tend to go with the RAF from Dorset, and parachutists tend to go from Lincolnshire. So immediately, if you're the GOC of an airborne division, you're spending an awful lot of time in aeroplanes, and this is certainly how 1st Airborne Division are set up. You're going backwards and forwards between Sleaford and places like Tarrant Rushden to be in touch with everybody and to keep a grip on stuff. Anyway, so there are many paradoxes in the planning for Market Garden. And the first paradox, and it's a huge factor this, and I think why the plan, for all its flaws as they're now depicted with hindsight, the reason why people go for it is this is the 17th operation.
Can you believe it?
The 17th operation they've had to contemplate since D-Day. So The whole thing is 1st Airborne have been in the UK as a whole since the beginning of the year. The last unit arriving being 11 Para, who joined 4th Parachute Brigade in January. They come into Liverpool and then they're deployed. You said disparate just now, Jim. This is one of the interesting things. So even its component parts are separate.
Yeah.
4th Parachute Brigade has been raised in Palestine, then deployed, and the amazing accounts from...
In Taranto.
Exactly. Deployed in Taranto, but only 2 battalions. 1, 5, 6 and 10 Para.
I mean, what the heck?
Yeah. 11 Para, a company of 11 Para, 14 Kos. The disastrous British operation in Kos, which is sort of mini Crete repeat, where the Germans insert Fallschirmjäger and overpower the British and the Italians there. So even the brigades within themselves have had this sort of strange genesis.
Yeah.
And the 1st Parachute Brigade, of course, has fought in North Africa and Sicily. 1st Air Landing Brigade has been part of Operation Ladbrokes as the glider insertion in Sicily, and it's a disaster. And in fact, the brigade is then withdrawn and has to be completely rebuilt.
Yeah, 69 out of 144 ditch in the sea.
That's right.
Only 4 gliders get anywhere near where they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Only 1 actually is involved in the operation.
Yeah.
Out of 144.
I know, it's desperate stuff, and it's...
1 out of 144 is actually involved in taking the bridge. And they do, but it is a total catastrophe.
But that catastrophe informs so much of how we end up with the Arnhem Air Plan. And anyone who goes, oh, why are the drop zones like they are, without considering Sicily, without considering North Africa, Sicily, and then Didier in turn.
Well, and so many of the main players are still involved, aren't they?
Yeah. And so they're thinking, we've got to avoid a repeat of that. So anyway, they've come back from the Med thinking that they're going to be used for Overlord, or the Second Front.
Yep.
And they discover on D-Day that they aren't being used for the Second Front. I mean, literally, that's when, the men find out that they're not going to France, is when D-Day is announced. So morale is pretty sort of squishy. They've only done one divisional size exercise called Operation Mush, in which 6 Airborne act as the enemy in an airborne operation, and 1st Airborne act as the invaders. So the men have very much got in their heads that they're part of the invasion force, whereas 6th Airborne are actually looking at how someone might deal with an airborne landing so that they can learn from that themselves to do one themselves. So there are real morale problems.
And 2 battalion-sized mutinies. I mean, what's going on there?
Well, so this goes to who they are. So, and more of the paradox is built into the whole thing. So when airborne forces are first created, Churchill issues a sort of summons, we need a commando-sized force of, I think it's 4,000 men, and we need parachutists as well for raiding, right?
Yes.
So initially, the idea is they're kind of raiding. There's been the German airborne operations in Falgelb that the whole world's going, wow, it's a futuristic...
This is back in 1940, an invasion of France and the Low Countries.
Yeah, it's a futuristic way of winning the war. And the Eben-Emael fort, which is this massive fortress on the Belgian border where the Germans come in gliders, land on the rooftop, and basically, German engineers are pioneers.
And again, this is on the 10th of May, 1940, the start of what we more commonly call the Blitzkrieg in the West.
That's right. And they trap the people in the fortress and render it inoperable. Of course, one of the things about gliders coming from Germany at dawn is they're coming out of the sunlight, so no one will ever see them.
Yes.
Right? So it works if you're the pesky...
You can't do that, though, can you, if you're coming from...
No, you're not. If you're the West, you can't do that. Yeah, it's extraordinary. So...
The foibles of geography.
Exactly. They've been looking at this, copying it, and all sorts of people join up. Lots of adventurers, Spanish Civil War people, buccaneers, people who are bored, people who don't like their current units, people who want the parachute pay. There's a wide variety of people. But one of the things that happens as they're starting to put it together is that they feel a need for sort of guard-style discipline, which means...
This is in 1944 by this point.
This is by 1944. This is sort of after North Africa and Sicily. The battalions are being reconstituted. And there's this real feel that there's a need for guard-style discipline. And if you've got battalions full of volunteers and adventurers and people who don't like the regular army and all that, they aren't going to put up with it.
They're not interested in spit and polish, are they?
No.
They're mavericks.
And there's one battalion commander him and his RSM are relieved of their jobs.
Really? Well, because they're just not spick and span enough. And they're not into Blanco.
No, because he's too into it and the men rebel.
No.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. They're not putting up with it. And that guy then goes on to basically become... very, very... It doesn't affect his career at all.
Oh, well, that's a relief.
Well, he gets a kind of feeling in the army like, paratroopers. Anyway. Then 11 Para, because that's 1 Para the mutiny's in 11 Para, they mutiny because on D-Day, they're not allowed their advance pay anymore after D-Day. And so the whole camp, the whole battalion goes out without signing out. They rebel as one. And again, the commanding officer is a guy called Mickey Thomas, who's raised that battalion himself, is fired. He's told he's too much of a gentleman by his brigadier, John Hackett, who we'll get to, right? And He's told he's too much of a gentleman for this parachuting business, even though, and he's fired, and when he's fired, all his officers offer to go with him, which suggests actually he's a pretty good battalion commander.
Does.
And that his men like him and are loyal to him. And he's killed on Mount Pinson in August before.
No. Okay. So he ends up in the Wessex Division.
That's right. Returns to his regiment. There are all these sort of weird tensions and things going on as they're doing hurry up and wait, as they're waiting for Overlord, and then they're waiting for Operation Wild Oats, Wastage, Tuxedo, Beneficiary, Hands Up, Sword Hilt, Transfigure, Linnet 2, and so on. All these ops.
They're terrific names, some of them. Sword Hilt, that's a name, isn't it?
Sword Hilt is a tremendous name. Wild Oats is the idea that they're going to seize Carpiquet airfield quite early in the Overlord campaign. But most of these ops, the idea is that they're going to exploit German collapse. They'll be dropped in, exploit German collapse as the Allies roll forward. And what happens each time is the Allies roll forward, so there's no need to do it, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is...
Events get the better on. By the time they can plan it, events have overtaken the original plans.
And some of these are planned completely in full, down to the absolute last sort of pack of fags in the supply column, and others are sort of purely conceptual and get thrown out. And there is a feeling within the planning side of things that some people are fantasizing about what airborne forces can do, and others are trying to be more realistic. And it's all very sort of fractured, because airborne forces, after all, are very ambitious people, full of people with lots of bright ideas. It's a thing that's kind of still trying to prove itself, and also it's looking for a new role, because up to this point, once they've mutated from being a raiding force, they turn into basically, it's about bridges and flanks and protecting seaborne landings.
But as you say, it's about buccaneers and adventurers. And buccaneers and adventurers are people who use their initiative of thinking about things, who don't just want to kind of follow the stream. They want to kind of make a difference. They want to kind of show what can be done and how they can personally have a stamp on great events in the Second World War. They're kind of glory seekers in a way, aren't they?
Yeah. There's an element of that. And also, if you're a man of push and go, and most people, and certainly most of the officers seem to be in 1st Airborne Division, if you're a man of push and go, this is where you go to push and go. But then what happens is you don't deploy. You've done all this training, you've convinced yourselves you're the absolute business, and then you don't deploy. And so there are, morale problems, there's training problems, because no one really knows quite what they're training for and all this. And there are real complications with this stop-start stuff. So Operation Transfigure, which is another one of these exploitation landing things. Mid-August, the orders are issued to the Seaborne Tail, because 1st Airborne Division has a Seaborne Tail of 84 officers, 2,180 other ranks.
I mean, that's amazing, because that's
a brigade.
2 and a bit infantry battalions.
Yes, or an airborne brigade.
Yes, it is,
It's a parachute brigade. Everything's smaller is the other thing, but we'll get to as well.
Yeah, so 500 men, not 850.
Yeah, so they set off from Lincolnshire. They drive down to Port of London. They sail to Normandy. They disembark in Normandy, and then they find out that the operation's cancelled.
And they're in Normandy.
And they're in Normandy, and they're all wearing red berets that they're terribly proud of, even though they're RESC people who haven't volunteered as paratroopers. So everyone's taking the piss. Their transport's really, really precious. 30 Corps start borrowing the transport off them, right? This also coincides with the decision.
We know what borrowing means.
Well, of course. Yeah, exactly. This coincides with the decision that the supply end needs to be completely reorganised. That 1st Allied Airborne Army decided we've got to completely reorganise our supply effort because it doesn't quite reflect the new reality that we think's coming of airborne operations. So all the officers involved in that they're in France, right? So you've got all sorts of complications that come with A, being airborne, and B, this stop-start life. And 2nd of August, 1st Allied Airborne Army is formed. So again, there's a reorganisation going on in August. And the idea of that is to bring in all the airborne assets in under Schafe's command under one roof.
And it's an army, though. It is an army.
It's an actual army.
It's an actual army, and it's sitting there, and it's full of highly motivated people, highly trained people who want to go and kill some Jerrys and some Krauts and want to get stuck in. Got to use them. For morale, you can't keep saying... Oh, it's all cancelled, boys.
And they're expensive.
You just can't, because you can't keep them up at that Viva Pitch state of readiness.
And they're expensive to train. They're really, really expensive to deploy. I mean, they're so expensive to train that 1st Airborne, when they do exercises, they pull up in lorries. They jump out of the lorries as though they've parachuted into a field, and then they rendezvous, and then they go on.
Here's a thought for you. Do you think they could ever just say to the Allied Airborne Army, do you know what, we're just not going to drop you out of planes. We're just going to deploy you on the ground.
Well, this is what everyone's terrified of.
Are they? So this is part of the conversation.
This is a big part of the conversation. And again, this comes to why people, in the end, accept the risk that goes. These people think we're a completely game-changing way of fighting, and we don't want to be deployed as line infantry. And obviously, one of the reasons they know the perils of that, because in North Africa, that's what happens, is in Tunisia, they get turned into line infantry. But one of the things about parachute battalions is they're triangular rather than square. They have 3 companies with 3 platoons.
Yes. And 3 companies rather than 4.
Yeah. So everything's smaller. Your reserve is smaller. Your reserve options are smaller. You're 2 up front, 1 behind, rather than 2 up front, 2 behind if you need to.
Yeah. So Dog Company is 2nd Battalion rather than 1st Battalion as it would be in a Normandy infantry.
So basically, normal infantry fighting attrits them really, really hard. In Normandy, and, we talked about, the Battle of Breville Ridge, you have 12 para lose 120 men one day.
Frankly, let's look at what happens to the German paratroop divisions who are deployed as infantry on the ground. They're not structured to do that.
No.
And yet they're the firefighters without the kit.
Yeah.
They might have lots of machine guns, but they haven't got enough guns and field artillery and any of that kind of stuff, and they get absolutely decimated.
Exactly.
Comparison with 1st Fallschirmjäger in southern Italy in first half of 1944.
The main difference between British and American airborne forces is they are deployed as infantry. They aren't saved up. There's the odd parachute operation after Crete, but they are deployed en masse and they aren't saved up.
But that's what's going to happen.
They're worried about that.
I mean, interesting, actually, that does happen to part of the 82nd Airborne, doesn't it, at Anzio?
Yeah.
There's a regiment of the 508th and there's a 504th, I think, if I remember rightly.
They see themselves as, special forces intervening, people who intervene and tip the table rather than have to do the drudgery. And the thing is so in Normandy, it's plain what will happen if you stay in the line from Normandy. Yep. No one wants to do that. And they think they're not for that. They're special people for, tipping the balance.
And in August 1944, you've got a situation where the Germans in Normandy are collapsing and then do collapse.
Yeah.
You've got this terrific victory. You've got the fall of Paris to the Allies, all these exciting things. You've got this sudden surge forward. But you've also got, from a British point of view particularly, you've got an infantry crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
And so these guys know that they're going to be next on the list if they're not careful, if they're not deployed.
And time is running out because supply aircraft are under such pressure. Mm-hmm. Because the supply situation, you're that much further from the Mulberry, so the supply situation is much more difficult. So the aircraft are becoming more precious, right?
Yep.
The weather is progressively getting worse. The days are getting shorter, which means your flying options are being reduced as the weather worsens. And also, there's more flak over Germany. So if you're going to, because the defence against the strategic bombing campaign, Holland really is kind of the last place left where you're going to be able to do this. Because if you're going to do a parachute insertion in the Ruhr, good luck, everybody, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to work. So the window's closing. There's an infantry crisis. People are desperate to go. They've been G'd up too many times because some of these operations, they implane and then are told, no, it's off, lads. This whole thing is the window's closing. And they're looking for this new exploitation role for airborne. So all these operations are about exploiting German collapse. So start of September, you get this thing called Operation Comet.
So this is first airborne. So this is not exclusively 1st British Airborne Division. This is the Airborne Army. This is Brereton, who's the 1st Allied Airborne Army Commander-in-Chief. Yeah. This is also presumably Boyd Browning. But is it Matthew Ridgway, who is the Airborne Corps Commander? Is it him? Is it Maxwell Taylor, who's in charge of the 101st now?
Comet, I believe, comes from Browning. But basically, the idea of Comet is to do what everyone knows as the Market Garden operation, to take all the bridges all the way out to Arnhem. But just with British 1st Airborne Division and with the Poles, who've been roped into things by now, have been trying to maintain their independence and have been roped in. And the idea is coup de main glider parties will take the bridges dotted all the way up. 1st Parachute Brigade will land at Arnhem and take the Arnhem Bridge. And Jim Woolwork of, Pegasus Bridge fame, famously flies his chalk into the bridge on the Caen Canal. He's meant to be taking South Staff guys to Nijmegen. And his plan is to surrender the minute he lands because he thinks, well, we're screwed. It's a suicide mission. There's no way that will ever work.
Really? But do you think at that stage, but at the beginning of September, hasn't it got more of a chance than it has on the 3rd week of September?
In John Buckley's book of essays, there is a chapter called A Week Too Late. And the Germans are certainly in more organisational chaos when they're proposing Comet than they are by the time of Market Garden's D-Day. So,
but in your humble opinion, not a chance.
Well, what happens is intel then comes through that 2 SS Panzer Corps are deploying and refitting in the Arnhem area. And it becomes clear...
So they don't know that... Which one is it? Is it the Frundsberg, which is about to go back to Berlin, or is it the Hohenzollern?
100,000. I'm not sure. It's
one of them is about to go.
Yeah, one of them is about to go. But the point is, they're in town. And the point about armour, of course, is it might be driving in one direction, but it can pretty soon drive in the other. And also, and this goes to later considerations around the battle, Arnhem, Holland isn't a curated battle space the way Normandy is, for instance, where all the transport links have been removed, like, surgically. There's none of that has happened.
Right.
And also everything's that much further away. You know, the nearest fighter tactical air force bases to Arnhem, for instance, are at the other side of Brussels. So it's 90, 100 miles to Arnhem. So you don't have the same enforcement of airspace that you do in Normandy. You haven't curated and throttled the battle space the way that they have in Normandy. You've got none of that.
Yep.
Right? So yes, they might be about to leave, but they may then turn around back again, and there's not much anyone can do about that. It's not the thing in Normandy where the Germans can only move at night because they'll get pounced on. It's a completely different environment in terms of the effectiveness of Allied air power.
Yep.
So anyway, the decision is made. We'll beef Comet up to Market Garden, and then we end up with, you know, the operation that people might be familiar with, the idea which is that 1st Airborne Division and the Poles, who are going to come on the 3rd lift, and we'll get to the lifts in a moment, that they take the bridges at Arnhem because it's the railway bridge, the pontoon bridge and the road bridge, not just the road bridge. So Urquhart's quote at the top Roy Urquhart's quote isn't quite right. I mean, it sounds great, but it's quite right. And then 82nd Airborne, the bridges around Nijmegen and that lead to Nijmegen, and then the Somme and Eindhoven taken by 101st Airborne. We're 30 Corps, 2nd Army, and that's the other thing, is in all of this, and all the accounts at the time, they aren't talking about 30 Corps, they're all talking about 2nd Army, which is really just one of those interesting distinctions, that the sort of post-war narrative has turned it into 30 Corps, but the people at the time are saying, where on earth...
Think of it as 2nd Army.
Where on earth was 2nd Army? You know?
Right, so they're not sitting on the bridge going, 30 Corps coming any moment. They're saying, where's 2nd Army coming?
No, it's where's 2nd Army? Who's that in 2nd Army we're talking to? So they've got to take the bridges. Now, one of the interesting things about this is the maps that go with this, and Mary Walters did a brilliant talk at We Have Waves Fest, which if you're a patron you can listen to, about the mapping at Arnhem, which shows that the rapid planning cycle that accompanied airborne operations meant that the quality of mapping deteriorated pretty fast, and the maps for Arnhem aren't very good. One of them, the one I looked at for my book, the road bridge isn't even on it. It has the word slaughterhouse.
That's amazing.
It has the word Slachthuis over where the bridge should be, slaughterhouse over where the bridge should be, So
it doesn't have a bridge at all, even though they've got to go and get it?
The pontoon bridge is marked as the road bridge.
That's not great, is it?
But that's one of the maps, because there are different maps, and the fact is the maps aren't very good. Some of them don't have the street detail on them. Urquhart afterwards says the street detail, the side street detail wasn't quite there. We'd have done better with better maps. But this is an example of how the planning cycle is deteriorating, and there aren't enough. You know, Jack Reynolds, who's a South Staff officer later on in the battle, he says, there are no maps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know there was an upper road, didn't know there was a
That's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, but also, that's the infantryman's lot. You know, he doesn't know where he is or what's going on. He's been told to go forwards. You know, that's the infantryman's lot. And for all the elite parachute, airborne, special forces thing, they're still infantrymen. They're still light infantrymen. Anyway, the big problem is everyone involved in airborne operations know there aren't enough aircraft to land everyone in one go.
Yep.
There are tons of planes, but there still aren't enough. And this is the thing we've talked about in the podcast a lot. The Allies are always 9 months away from having the ideal means to do the things they're trying to pull off. There aren't the transport planes. So Lewis Brereton won't authorise 2 lifts within 24 hours because the days are shorter, the journey's longer. It's not like popping across the Channel. You've got to go across the North Sea, you've got to go across occupied Holland or up through over Belgium and up. There's a southern route and a northern route. And he won't authorise the aircraft, the crews to be released. And the thing is, he's been criticised a lot for this, but I'm quite sympathetic with it.
Yep.
You know, his job is to protect his air crews. And so the air plan has this sort of paradoxes built into it. It's enabled by lots of things, which is...
Like everything else in this
Like everything,
plan.
exactly. The air plan is enabled by air supremacy because it's an armada of slow-moving, low-flying transport aircraft, parachute planes with gliders.
Which you can only do if you rule the skies.
Yeah, and you're 1,500 feet, some of them. So you can't have fighters get in amongst that. That's unacceptable. And also ground-based air defences. So 2nd Tactical Air Force are scheduled to do this massive fighter strike on flat targets. And the thing about that, and a medium bomber strike as well, the Americans do a medium bomber strike. The thing about that is you can plan that quite easily. You know where you're going to attack and you put it in. It's a world away from flying a cab rank over a battlefield.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things that in the accounts you get people going, where are the Air Force? They were there on the first day. You think, well, these tasks are wildly different, require wildly different things of each other, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, there is with this, though, the determination to land as a division. And this comes to, I think, this is the thing you said to me about 3 years ago. You said, I've had this light bulb. They're expecting the drop to go wrong. They're expecting the landings to screw up, which is why they're trying to land as many people as they possibly can, right?
Yep.
And the paradox of the air plan is this, because the air plan requires 1st Parachute Brigade to go to the bridge and 1st Air Landing Brigade, who land by glider, to defend the landing zones and drop zones for the reinforcements who are coming, the 2nd and 3rd lift.
So that's the problem, isn't it?
That is the problem. And that's built on paradox, because if the air plan works, you don't need anyone else to come to Arnhem.
Yes.
Because you've got a parachute brigade and
you've got enough.
You've got 2 brigades, and the air landing brigade is much larger than the parachute brigade, more heavily armed and better equipped. So you don't need to hang on to the drop zones and wait for the extra people to turn up tomorrow. But the expectation, of course, is it won't work because none of the air plans have worked so far. So you build an air plan that is predicated on the possible failure of the air plan, right?
Which is a nonsense.
Because the air plan works, but no air plan has so far worked. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right to do this because in your experience, no air plan has worked. Even Normandy, which is regarded as a successful airborne operation, the air plan doesn't really work. So you've got to look at Sicily. You've got to look at Sicily. You've got to look at North Africa. You've got to look at the lessons of those, which is we need as many people to try and get there as possible because they won't get there because that's how we maximise and concentrate our effort.
But the consequence of that is that you need more people to do the airlift, which means you're then sacrificing the equipment, which those who do make it then don't have enough of.
And your fighting strength is diluted necessarily. Right?
Oh.
So, and that's the paradox, because whenever I talk about what's the what if, and I always think if there's a what if, you're not allowed to sort of magic up an extra brigade or anything. The what if is, you know, what are they capable of doing on day one? And you start there. And what they're capable of doing on day one is landing an air landing brigade and a parachute brigade. Well, then they should both go to the bridge.
Yep.
You know, because what the Germans muster on the day, and we'll get to that, the parachute brigade is kind of on a 3-to-1 footing against. Kind of, for attack, as we all know.
Yep.
But if you've got the air landing brigades involved, you're on an 8-to-1 footing.
Oh, God. It's so frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah, plan is, first lift, Sunday, 1400 hours-ish. 1st Air Landing Brigade come in, minus a couple of companies of South Stafford's land by glider, adjacent to, on an LZ, adjacent to 1st Parachute Brigade under Gerald Lathbury. So that's the first lift that we've touched on. The second lift is meant to come at 0800 hours on Monday morning, 4th Parachute Brigade on the Ginkle Heath. The third lift is the Tuesday morning, the Polish Paras landing south of the river and their glider equipment landing north of the river, which indicates the belief that they will hold the bridge by that point. And anyway, Second Army is meant to have arrived by the Tuesday and relieving them. So they're kind of being brought in as reinforcements, strictly speaking. And the Poles have been promised that the minute they reach I think it's a 5% casualty rate, they'll be withdrawn anyway so they can be saved up for going to Warsaw or something. And then there's subsequent supply lifts. And of the first lift, 1st Air Landing Brigade is to stay behind. 1st Parachute Brigade is to race for the bridge.
Got it. So 1st Air Landing Brigade, stay where they are, hold the landing zones, hold the drop zones. And then 1st Parachute Brigade, hot foot it into town, 8 miles.
Exactly.
It is.
And we'll very quickly do why are they landing where they're landing. And they're landing where they're landing because that is the best place to land. Indeed, arguably, to do what they're trying to do, it's the only place they can possibly...
Only place.
Yeah. Because...
And trust me, when you're there, it all makes sense.
You stand in the middle of the LZs, and they're these vast fields. And what you're trying to do is land a lot of gliders and unload them as quickly as possible.
And for that, you need space.
And you need space.
And you need flat space.
Flat space. And you need fields that aren't cut up with fences. And you have your A pilots who land in the corner. Everyone else, the B pilots all vector on the guy who've landed in the corner of the field, and everything's hunky-dory. It's 60 feet above sea level, so the land is relatively dry. South of the river, you look at it at a glance south of the river, this is big space, but it's small fields cut up with lots of drainage ditches with fencing around them. There are power cables in the space south of the river. You're close to the German flak. You wouldn't be able to land an air landing brigade successfully in that space. You could land parachutists, but their gliders would have to land somewhere else, and they need the anti-tank guns, they need the jeeps. It's not that the drop zones are too far from the bridge, they're as close as they possibly can be. And it's what they then do that is the factor, I think. It's what they then elect to do, the parachute brigade then elect to do, more than where they're landed, that influences how things pan out. See you in a second for what happens on D-Day of Operation Market Garden, or Market rather, in Arnhem. Welcome back to We Have Ways to Make You Talk. So, we offered you D-Day of Market, because Market's the airborne bit, Garden's the ground-borne bit. We offered you D-Day of Market in Arnhem. And on the Sunday, it's a Sunday morning, 09:45 hours, more than 3,500 planes set off for Market Garden. You know, and this is a big event that people see it from their churches and, you know, hear all the roar of these aircraft.
Yep.
They're accompanied by a simultaneous 2nd Tactical Air Force effort to suppress flak. And there's flak at an airport a few miles northeast of Arnhem called Deelen that has to be suppressed.
Deelen's a major air base and control and command centre.
Exactly.
For the Luftwaffe. It's where they got the single most sophisticated kind of ground control kit you could possibly have. It's all kind of glass screens with maps on and lights going on and all that kind of stuff.
Right, oh gosh.
Yeah, it's all pretty good.
Deelen has been earmarked, in the event of the operation being successful, as an airlift point for everyone's favourite Lowland Division, 52nd Lowland Division, who've been reclassified from mounted soldiers to air portable. And the idea is if once 2nd Army pop through Arnhem and mushroom out, Deelen will be taken, and then you bring in an air portable division to... That doesn't happen. You all know that doesn't happen. I just thought Andy Aitchison would like to mention. It's regarded as an uneventful flight. You've 475 planes delivering British paratroopers, Albemarles, Dakotas, Stirlings, Halifaxes. You've got 320 glider tug combos from 38 and 46 Group RAF.
Yep.
143 Dakotas bringing in 1st Parachute Brigade. 1240, the first men land from 12 Stirlings, their 21st Independent Company. 186 men landing in each of the L and DZs. And their job is to set up Rebecca and Eureka, the transmitters that guide in the rest of the Airborne Division.
These are radio beacons that kind of guide in. So you have a guy on the ground, and that's linked to kind of leading Dakotas or whatever it might be, and they can see it and they go, all right, we're honing in.
And it's a clever bit
place.
of kit because it's passive. So the one on the ground waits to be challenged by the equipment of the aircraft, and then goes, hello, I'm here, and then you home in on that. This is commanded by Boy Wilson, who's a great war veteran, and he's the oldest parachutist in the division. He's handpicked the men himself.
Yep, what a lad.
He's a proper lad. There's lots of German Jews in the Independent Company. They've brought boot polish for the parade, and booze, and they're super specialised people, and really should never get involved in the fighting proper. At 1300 hours to 1340 hours, the gliders arrive. On LZS, the South Staff start to arrive, although minus 2 companies. Then the rest of the Air Landing Brigade, 1st Border Regiment, although their commanding officer's glider fails to make it. So his 2IC, Cousins, takes over. Colonel Haddon doesn't get there. 7th KOSB, Kings and Scottish Borders, they arrive. So 153 gliders from that lift leave the UK. 19 fail to make it. These are vast landings. They're tricky. It crashes. 12 men are killed. One Staff's glider, 21 platoon, lands on top of a machine gun nest, and there's a firefight then and there as they overpower the German crew. So 2 guys killed, 7 wounded.
But for the most part, successful.
Everyone's saying it's like an exercise. And on a war game, some umpire would have come up and gone, well, you've landed on a machine gun nest, I'm afraid, chaps, you're not in the war game anymore. And there would have been accidents, because you get gliders nose going into the ground and flipping up. And
yeah, because they're crash landing, aren't they? Every single one.
Exactly. Crash landing. It's all crash landings. And they're running into the trees and all this sort of stuff. Then from 1319 on the adjacent LZ, Urquhart arrives. And this lift from 1319 on is the divisional troops. So it's Divisional HQ, 2 batteries of the Light Regiment Artillery, Recce Squadron Jeeps, and 1st Parachute Brigades transport and guns. Because the paras need their kit, their transport. 167 of those gliders are due, 150 arrive, and guns and ammo for the Light Regiment, for the artillery, are missing. Some Hamilcar turns over, and a 17-pounder is unrecovered. But really fine.
Way more successful than anticipated.
Than any drop in the history of airborne operations.
Heretofore.
You can't argue with the success of the air plan in itself. Right? Then at 1350, they all watch, and there's a frenzy of activity. They take the tails off the back of the gliders, they're dragging the stuff out, they're pulling the 6-pounders out, they're getting the stores together, and there's lots of really tremendous photos of that of that stuff happening. And always in the background of the photos, there's a glider that's upside down, or there's blokes kind of going, oh God, like we can't get the tail off and all that, right? But that rush to move. At 1350 hours, 1st Parachute Brigade and the other parachute soldiers start to arrive. 2,283 men. One man's chute doesn't open. He has what they called a streamer. There are 4 refusals.
Yep.
You got some broken legs, people knocked out. But that's all completely priced in.
But what are we talking about? Like 2%?
Yeah, I mean, nothing. Nothing to affect anything. You've then got people meeting at their rendezvous. 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, they use Major Digby Tate Mort, who's a very famous Arnhem character. He's using bugle calls because he's Ox and Bucks. He's 52nd Regiment of Foot, and he's using bugle calls as would have been used at Waterloo to gather his men because he knows that's a really good way of doing it, right?
Yeah, works then, works now.
Exactly. State of the art, whichever century. But there is a feeling... there is a feeling that
I'll remember that next time I pull out my bugle.
Well, absolutely. There is a feeling though that it's like an exercise, and civilians turn out to watch, celebrate their liberation. They're offering men jugs of airsats, coffee and kisses. There's orange flags everywhere.
I think we should launch We Have Ways Fest V for Victory next year with a bugle call.
Bugle, state of the art, whatever century. Why not? There's a lunatic asylum by Wolfhazer, which is one of the villages to the west of Oosterbeek, and that's been struck on the understanding it's a garrison. So and it's a moment in the movie where Urquhart, Sean Connery says, "I think they're laughing at me," whatever. But that's real. There are inmates from the, what was called a lunatic asylum at the time and lots have been killed. There's actually some bitterness about that from some people. Fair enough. But the airplane's been a triumph. Everyone is where they're meant to be. Bang on time. Everyone knows where they are.
Yeah.
So what happens next? And at first air landing, who are not going to the bridge, despite being battalions of 850 men rather than kind of 550.
They're staying where they are?
They're staying where they are, deploying to protect the LZs and DZs. So the 1st Border Regiment move out to the west and to the south to sort of picket the line that runs down the edge of the LZs. And one of their companies, B Company, go down as far as a place called Renkum, where there's a brickworks, and occupy that, which is on the main road that runs in along the river that then comes up to Oosterbeek from the southwest. And they go down and occupy that. And they're off on their own, B Company, which is quite interesting because it kind of speaks to them not really expecting an opposition. 7th KSB, King's Own Scottish Borders, then go northwest to cover the Ginkle Heath, where the 2nd lift will be coming tomorrow. So immediately you're dissipating your combat power, because that drop zone's even further away. Why they aren't landing 4th Parachute Brigade on the same DZ that 1st Parachute Brigade landed on, I don't know. It's been decided. It puts them north of the railway line for their approach into the town, is the argument. But it strikes me as kind of odd.
Yeah.
And that drop zone's 9 miles from the bridge. They run into Dutch SS.
A swine.
Around there, exactly. The treacherous fiends.
Yep.
Then the 3 parachute battalions and brigade troops under Brigadier General Lathbury set off for the bridge on 3 routes, Lion, Tiger and Leopard. And this is the same plan as he'd drawn up for Comet.
Yes.
I think that in itself is quite interesting because one of the criticisms Roy Urquhart has often undergone is that he's not an airborne guy. So he doesn't know how we do things in the magical airborne world. But he defers to their judgment. He gives them what they want. He doesn't say to Lathbury, "You sure that's going to work? You sure that's a good idea?"
How should we do this, boys?
Exactly. Surely you should be holding a battalion back in reserve, chaps. Gerald, are you sure about this? No, don't worry, old boy, it'll work. And that is very peculiar. Lathbury doesn't concentrate his force, he dissipates it immediately. He holds one para back for half an hour, as if to say,
Do you think it was a case of just saying one and everyone go online?
Yeah. It's very strange, this idea that you send them on 3 routes.
It's actually, it's not only strange, it's actually bonkers because why would you dissipate your force even further than it's already been dissipated? On what school of military thinking would suggest that that's a good idea?
It's hard to say.
Is it contingency again? Is it, but we might find the other one blocked, so, we want to find another route through? Is that what it is? But it's insane.
It's nuts. One way or another, you're not concentrating your effort, which, as we all know...
Schwerpunkt is all.
Exactly. You punch with your fist, not with your fingers open, and all that stuff.
Knocken, nicked, blixen, or whatever it is.
Klotzen, nick, kleppen, or what it is. You've also got the Recce Squadron.
Klecken, that's it. Knocken, nicked, klecken. Whatever.
You've also got
Don't do German.
You've also got the Recce Squadron, who have got sort of SAS K-gun style jeeps. And the idea is they're going to race ahead and take the bridge. But they're not equipped for a fight. They're equipped, like so much of the airborne establishment.
They're equipped to go hurtle through a roadblock, a lightly armed roadblock, and hurtle on again. But then once they get to where they've got to get to, they're stuffed because they haven't got enough.
But everything's about defence, actually. The idea is you land somewhere, you hold it and you defend it. And we're going to run into the adage that we've had on all the Normandy podcasts, attacking is hard. And attacking is much, 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 much harder when you're equipped like an airborne division. So anyway, they set off. They have trouble getting off their LZ. Urquhart, in his account, says, the Jeeps never made it. They were lost. That's not true. That became part of the sort of story. They had trouble deploying because sometimes you could get the tail off the glider and they got held up. But their fate is an early sign of what the Germans have in store, because now we have to get to the Germans, as Gene Hackman calls them.
Yes, and we've got 2 SS Panzer Corps, which is commanded by Bittrick, as it was in the Normandy campaign.
Yeah.
And we've got the 9th Hohenstaufen Panzer SS under Walter Harzer, and 10 SS Frundsberg under Heinz Hamel.
Heinz Hamel.
Yeah, Hamel.
I've got Hamel, wouldn't we? Or is it Hamel?
Yes, exactly. So anyway, it's these 2 coves, and they're refitting, but I think it's the Frundsberg, isn't it? Or is it the Hohenstaufen? I can't remember. But one of them is heading off, is literally loading up. And they've already started loading up to go back to Berlin, because they've been obliterated. I mean, they've had some replacements have come in, but the replacements are teenagers and they haven't assimilated and all that kind of stuff. And so they're in a right old state, and they've got a fraction of what they should have in terms of equipment and armoured fighting vehicles and half-tracks and panzers and whatnot. So let's not be too overwhelmed by the fact that there's 2 SS Panzer Corps here.
They do have some AFVs. They do have armoured fighting vehicles.
They do have some armoured fighting vehicles. And they have some self-propelled tanks, which when you're up against airborne forces who have nothing, it's a bit like having a Lee Grant tank in the admin box and the Japanese having nothing.
Very, very, very good analogy. And their Army Group B boss is Mödel, of course. His headquarters is at the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, which becomes a dressing station later in the battle.
Yes, of course.
He thinks they're coming for me, but for a moment he thinks that. I mean, again, that's part of the Arnhem legend. They come here for me.
Is Mödel's the one with another of those coves like von Mackensen with a monocle?
He's the Führer's fireman and all that stuff.
He's a right old piece of work.
He's a proper piece of work. And all of these people are pieces of work. They're all Nazis, old school. If they survive the noose, they end up forming sort of SS revisionist groups and all this. These are bad people. Anyway, he flees. He goes to a Bittrick's HQ in Dirtingham, and says, right, he makes some decisions. He makes decisions immediately. 10 SS Panzer ordered to Nijmegen, 9 SS Panzer to Arnhem.
Yep.
So that means 9 SS Panzer Division's 40 vehicle Recce Battalion under Hauptsturmführer Victor Grebner ordered south to Nijmegen. And he's a guy who's tooling around in the captured dingo that he got.
Yes. And why wouldn't you?
Well, exactly, because they're great fun. He will re-emerge in the story.
We'll be meeting with him again.
But not in this episode.
No.
Then Obersturmbannführer Ludwig Spindler, who's the commander of 9th SS Armoured Artillery Regiment, sets up Kampfgruppe Spindler, 120 men, and it grows. In the late afternoon, he's ordered to advance west to Oosterbeek and establish a blocking line to prevent the British from reaching Arnhem Centre. But it's not him that tips the balance in the afternoon. It's another guy. Sepp Kraft.
Yes. I was wondering when he was going to enter the story.
The thing about Kraft is he wrote a report of his Arnhem intervention.
For those who want to know, it's Kraft. Kraft.
So he writes to Himmler after the battle about what a brilliant job he did saving the Third Reich.
Yeah. He's not shy about coming forward about his own brilliance, is he?
Yeah, and he's a pretty unreliable witness. But he pulls together Battalion Kraft, which is an SS Panzer Grenadier depot and reserve battalion. It's people in training. It's NCOs and kids. And he sets up a blocking line from Wolfhazer in the west. It's a small settlement and there's a level crossing across the railway line and all the way down to the main road, the Utrechtsweg. And these are the routes, that covers the routes that both 1 and 3 Para and the Recce Squadron take. By pure fluke, Lathbury, by dispersing his effort, has run 2 of his battalions.
If only they'd all gone down Lion.
Or all down one route. If you send all 3... But
actually, it doesn't really matter, does it? Because they'd have overwhelmed anything that Kraft...
concentration of effort. Yep. But he knows what you got to do is drive straight into an airborne landing. You've got to create delay. You've got to not worry about casualties. Yep. And with machine guns and armoured cars...
Unfortunately, being SS types, that's not really an issue.
Exactly. And you can disrupt and hold up. But the German accounts will speak of confusion. No one knew what was going on. At least there are no Jabos. They're all saying there's no...
Jabos being the German for fighter bomber.
Exactly.
Bomber. It's a truncation of Jagd bomber, so they call them Jabos. These are fighter planes that swoop in low, dropping bombs, machine gunning, strafing, all that kind of stuff.
Shoot you up as you're on your bicycle on your way to wherever the emergency is.
Yeah, all of that.
But it's soldiers, it's sailors, it's cadets, people on bicycles rushing for Arnhem. The Germans realise immediately what's going on, because the thing about the element of surprise with an airborne landing is it wears off quite quickly. It's particularly if there's a bloody great bridge that's the last bridge across the Rhine at stake.
Yes, it's fairly obvious what's going on. But I think the point to really stress here is that in this area, this is a kind of, take a deep breath, pause for a minute, get yourself all sorted out, try and get training battalions in, start to assimilate them into bigger units, send a whole load of stuff back to Berlin, get some other stuff back in. This area is full of German troops. The German troops that are here are there to be rehabilitated, reorganised, refine their balance. They're not there to be flung into action. It's just coincidence that they happen to be there.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also clear what...
They might not have been.
Exactly, but it's also clear what's going on. And so it's clear what you need to do.
Yes.
So, and the British have got a problem with radios, but everyone's expecting this. You land and within an hour, the idea that the radios will all work is daft, is a wild expectation.
Yeah.
And because there's been a delay with the Recce Squadron deploying, Urquhart summons Freddie Goff, who's in charge of the Major Freddie Goff, to see him, rather than just let him bash on. So causes muddle and confusion.
Yeah.
C Troop of the Recce Squadron are going down the parallel veg north of the railway line.
It's on an embankment, isn't it? It's like a wall between the kind of suburban bit of Wolfhazer and the edge of Easterbeek and the kind of actually rolling pasture and woodlands and low hills to the north of the railway line. And then there is this freaking great wall, which is effectively the embankment of the railway. Yeah.
The railway line rises and falls, or rather the ground around it rises and falls. The illusion is that the railway line rises and falls. The ground around it rises and falls. And they're going down this road, and their C Troop, Lieutenant Bucknell is of the Recce Squadron, are ambushed coming down the north of the railway line. Lieutenant Bucknell's killed, and they give up the attempt to come into Arnhem from the north. Also, Roy Urquhart's Jeep is hit by a mortar, the rover radio is smashed up, so he makes a fateful decision, which is to go forward to relay to 1st Parachute Brigade that the Recce Squadron haven't got through and to urge them on. So he abandons his headquarters. He notices that the men are being, he thinks, too cautious under fire. After all, for most of 1st Airborne Division, there's lots of new people. It's their first time under fire. There are wire fences running down the side of the road, which makes it very difficult to take cover when you're fired on. Mm-hmm. German armoured cars will pop up at a junction, fire at the column, disappear.
Yep.
Single machine guns, and the business of
which adds confusion and a sense of if you're the British, you don't know quite what your enemy strength is.
Exactly. And the odd man here being wounded, bloke staying behind, this whole ongoing sort of friction. So it's really important. 1st Parachute Brigade's effort is dispersed. 1st Parachute Battalion take Leopard route. They're under Lieutenant Colonel David Dobie.
Yes.
They're meant to go up round to the north, and they're blocked by Kraft. And he doesn't like this plan. He doesn't like the idea that because he's meant to be taking high ground in the town later on.
Right.
And he thinks it's pointless. He thinks this is like a chimera.
And he's got a point.
He's got a point. 3 Para, they take the Tiger route, which is the central route.
Yes.
And they're the people who shoot up the Stadtkommandant Major General Kussin, who's the...
Yes, in his Citroen. And very, very famous picture of him with his scalp split lying on the pavement with a cigarette burned down to his fingertips. Him and his guys all killed. And that's a still from footage. You see the lads all marching past as they're coming past the Wolfhazer crossroads. Yeah. And this poor Citroen just ruined and riddled with bullets. It's a tragedy.
I know. Yeah, I mean, it won't buff out, that.
No. New skins and everything on that one.
But that also demonstrates that Major Generals rushing around in the environs of Arnhem in this chaos is probably not a good idea.
No, stay where you are.
Stay where you are. Stay with the radio. Stay with the headquarters. Fitch's companies all get separated.
Yep.
And he orders C Company ahead, and they press along the railway line, and they actually get through eventually to the bridge. But the battalion stops for the night because Roy Urquhart, Major General Urquhart, and Brigadier Gerald Lathbury have attached themselves to Fitch's battalion HQ.
Right.
And that, if you're a battalion commander, that will cramp your style. There's no other way of looking at it.
You can't beat around the bush. That's what's going to happen.
So they pause for the night. I mean, they've had a tough time of it, though. The fighting has sort of spiraled kind of out of control. And there's a feeling that they should crack on rather than engage, but they engage. Or the Germans engage them. Then 2 Para go down Lion route, which is the southern route, which we walked a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Where you walk all the way along the bottom of the settlements.
Mm-hmm. You've got the river on your right.
Exactly. C Company are meant to go to the railway bridge. They're meant to then go over the railway bridge and come up to the road bridge to take the south. But the railway bridge is blown when they arrive.
And second para is commanded by John Frost, and he's the hero of the Bruneval raid, which is 1942, I think I'm rightly saying, which is where they do this attack on the French coast and take out the radar station and all the rest of it.
That's right.
He's been in North Africa. He's also been in Iraq, hasn't he? I think so. Palestine.
Yes, he's come from there,
with his hunting horn and his golf clubs.
Yeah, that's right.
He's very religious, isn't he? He's very devout, but also a big drinker.
Yeah. Well, yes, he's traditionally devout. His brother-in-law, Major Potts, John Potts, who's the commanding officer of A Company in 156 Para, is sort of evangelical. And Potts is an extraordinary man. You know, when he's parachute training in the Sea of Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, he sits there and sort of muses that this is where the Sermon on the Mount was delivered, all this sort of stuff, while on exercise. He's a real character.
But Frost is a tremendous fellow, isn't
Brilliant
he?
man.
You know, he's been in Sicily as well. He's been there, done it, got the T-shirt.
Huge tactical sense. Something of a mystery that he's not the brigade commander of one parachute brigade, but there you are. Yep. And he says, we've got to press on. He has snakes of men. His men work as a sort of snake, and they go in through people's gardens, through the back doors, then out through the front door, into the next door. He tells them not to engage. Mm-hmm. One of his companies, in the darkness, come up to the high ground at a place called Den Brink, which is just to the west of the Arnhem town.
Yep.
And he makes them stay put until nightfall so they can move on unseen. So his tactical sense and his understanding of how to move through this built-up area, because that's the thing that really struck me when we walked this, is you go from this wide open sort of rural expanse to a built-up area, to streets, and fighting in built-up areas is really, 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 really hard.
Really difficult, yep.
And you need someone who really knows how to do that. A Company arrive at the bridge at 19:30 hours. Trucks go over in the gloom. 2 platoon under Lieutenant Jack Graben, who, again, will become a figure in the story later. They try to get across the bridge. 8 men are wounded. Graben's wounded the shoulder, so he's carrying a shoulder wound for the rest of the battle. Sappers later with a flamethrower. 6-pounder engages the pillbox. Sappers with a flamethrower later set fire to the bridge, set off the ammunition behind the pillbox, and the bridge burns and lights the town all night that night, like daylight. So, Craft has delayed 1 and 3 para. Spindler has made it harder to get into the town. But in turn... And I think this is another way of looking at this. 1 and 3 para, because their plan is so mad, right?
Yes.
Creates such confusion for the Germans, right? Because the plan makes no sense at all.
Because they're absolutely everywhere and not concentrating at all.
Exactly. Like they're just popping up all over. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
They've actually... That effort has stopped the Germans preventing Frost getting to the bridge.
So he gets there because of the confusion. It's a bit like Normandy and the Americans, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
By being all over the place, it makes them feel like there's more and it's harder to kind of second guess what the hell's going on.
Exactly. And also, the Germans, for some reason, 2 SS Panzer Corps, for some reason, as Heinz Harmel points out, they don't garrison the bridge.
No.
Why not? And Harmel says if only Graebner had left a few soldiers behind to reinforce the bridge security, then it would have been a different story. Graebner had been too certain of himself. He was totally preoccupied with what he might find at Nijmegen. That is a bit of the story that tends to get sort of, Frost made it to the bridge.
Yeah.
Yes, Frost did make it to the bridge. And when he got there was no one there. What? It's bananas.
Yes. It's a bridge. It's a key bit of ground. Yeah. It's a key feature. Why on earth would you leave this abandoned? Well, you do because there's confusion elsewhere and because you've also got to go and head off a whole load of troops down to Nijmegen.
Yeah. We've talked in Normandy, when talking about Normandy and the airborne landings in Normandy, I always sort of say you can't make too much of a virtue of the confusion that comes with an airborne landing. It kind of always feels like people resort to that as an argument rather than the operation wasn't a particular success, but it caused great confusion to the enemy. But in this instance, the confusion, Lathbury's mad, bonkers plan confuses the Germans to the point where Frost is able to reach the bridge. He hasn't taken the railway bridge, though, so he's not succeeded in all his objectives either. But at midnight...
Midnight on Monday.
Frost is at the bridge, which burns, lighting up the town. 1 para stuck in Oosterbeek, A Company having already lost 50% of it.
And Oosterbeek is this sort of well-to-do suburb, sort of outlying kind of village town from Arnhem, to the west of Arnhem.
Sits to the west, to the left on the map. When I went to school in Bedford, there's Bedford and there's a village called Clapham that's just adjacent to Bedford. It's like Bedford and Clapham.
It's Clapham. It's the Clapham of Bedford.
If people know Bedford and Clapham, it's Clapham and Bedford. And there's a bridge in Bedford, Should we need to take it, don't get stuck in Clapham. So 3 para have also stopped in Oosterbeek with Roy Urquhart and Lathbury in Battalion HQ, cramping Fitch's style. The air landing battalions are in place defending the landing zones. The British wait for the second lift, due first thing. The Germans reorganise and reinforce, and Roy Urquhart decides it's a great time to lie down on a sofa and have a sleep. And that...
Dear listeners,
and that is where we end part 1 of our Market Garden series. I mean,
it's already heating up in a big way.
Well, there's lots to get through. There's lots of these slender things, these slender contingencies that are all...
Yeah, these movements, these twists and turns.
Always worth talking about. We will be back. Our next episode, Jim, what are we going to talk about in part 2 of our Market Garden?
Well, we're going to be talking about what's going on, what the plan for 2nd Army, 30 Corps, and also what's happening with the 2 American Airborne Divisions. Not 1 American Airborne Division, 2 American Airborne Divisions. So we'll be looking at that at Arnhem area and Nijmegen, which, after all, is only about 8 miles south of Arnhem.
If you're keen to hear all these in one lump, then you subscribe as officer class to our Apple channel or become a patron. We have ways of making you talk Patreon, where there are other talks. Professor John Tregonning did a talk about the medics at Arnhem. Marion Walters, as I mentioned earlier, did a talk about the mapping, which is a fascinating story and most dispiriting. And there's, obviously, we don't want to lay a real downer on you this September, but this is a story where you think, oh, God, it could have been over by Christmas. Anyway, join us for part 2. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.